In the last week of February 1874, a deputy sheriff named Wat Purnell rode into a fork of Bear Creek in Izard County, Arkansas, with 2 hired trackers, following word that no smoke had risen from a trapper's cabin in 19 days. The trapper was a man named Amos Coldiron, 46 years old, who had worked that hollow alone since the autumn of 1863. They found the cabin door standing open and the hearth long dead, a coffee pot boiled dry on the cold grate. The smokehouse behind the cabin held their attention far longer than the cabin itself. It was a squat structure of hewn log and river stone that Coldiron had raised with his own hands his first season on the land, and had in the years since altered twice. He had set a second door inside the first, and he had fitted an iron hasp and a padlock to the outside. A trapper locks a smokehouse to keep dogs and possums from the meat curing inside it. He does not ordinarily need 2 doors, and he does not need a lock a man could work loose from the inside in the dark. Purnell tried the hasp, found it fastened, and split it with the flat of an axe. Behind the second door, hung from drying poles where hams and shoulders of venison should have been, there was nothing at all. The poles were bare and scrubbed, and the floor beneath them had been swept clean enough that the deputy's boot heel rang on stone. 11 winters of a working trapper's smokehouse, and not one strip of meat cured in it. Only a tally book, wrapped in oilcloth, set square in the middle of the floor, as if it had been left there on purpose for whoever came next. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Bear Creek Hollow sits in the White River country of the Arkansas Ozarks, a fold of steep timbered ridges some 6 miles from the nearest passable road and 11 from the county seat at Melbourne, where the courthouse held the only telegraph key in that part of the county. In 1863, the land carried no name a surveyor would recognize. It was simply unclaimed hollow ground, heavy with white oak and shortleaf pine, cut by a creek that ran cold even in August because it rose from a limestone spring rather than surface runoff. Trapping was a solitary trade in that country, and it was meant to be one. A man working mink, otter, and beaver through an Ozark winter went into the timber alone in October and was not expected to be seen again until the ice broke, and sometimes not until the spring pelts were carried out to sell at the settlement store, a season's income riding on how well a man could stand his own company. Coldiron had come from somewhere in eastern Tennessee, by his own account, though no one in the hollow ever pressed him on it, since a man's reasons for going that far into the timber alone were understood to be his own business and nobody else's. He built his cabin on a bench of ground above the creek, cleared perhaps 2 acres for a garden and a few hogs, and ran trap lines that reached, by the accounts of men who occasionally crossed his sign, as far as 4 miles out in 3 directions. He was known to the Ballinger family, who farmed the nearest bottomland a little over 2 miles downstream, and to the storekeeper at Sylamore, where he traded pelts twice a year for salt, powder, and coffee, and where his prices were remembered as fair even in years when mink brought less than $1 a pelt. Nobody thought it strange that Coldiron went unseen for months at a stretch. That was the ordinary rhythm of the trade, and a trapper who wanted company would not have chosen that hollow to begin with. Mail reached the settlement store at Sylamore once every 10 days by rider from Melbourne, and even that service was suspended through the worst weeks of a hard winter, so a man 40 minutes short of the road by horse and the better part of a day short of it on foot might go a full season with no word passed either direction. It was, by the standard of that country, an ordinary kind of silence. What made the winter of 1873 different, and what eventually brought Wat Purnell up that creek, was that Coldiron had never once missed the January trip to Sylamore in 10 years, and in 1874 he did not come. Josiah Ballinger, 39 years old and the nearest neighbor with any standing to speak on the matter, gave the fullest account anyone ever recorded of Coldiron's last years, and he gave it reluctantly, more than a month after the smokehouse was opened, and only after the circuit judge in Melbourne sent word that he was required to. He said that the trapper he had known in the 1860s was not the man he came to know by 1870. The early cold iron was solid and quiet, a fair trader who once helped Ballinger raise a barn without being asked twice. Bollinger testified that the later cold iron had grown thin in a way he struggled to describe to the court, though garden and hogs were tended as carefully as ever, so it was plainly not a want of food. The thinness looked to him like something spending itself inside a man faster than it could be replaced. Ballinger testified that sometime around 1868, cold iron began keeping to a schedule he had never kept before. Each evening, without exception, and regardless of weather, he carried a covered pail from the cabin to the smokehouse, went inside, and stayed exactly as long as it took a man to smoke a full pipe, by Ballinger's estimate near 20 minutes, before locking the hasp behind him and returning to the cabin. Ballinger said he asked about it only once, in the fall of 1870, when he had ridden up to trade a sack of cornmeal for a mink pelt and arrived at dusk, just as cold iron was crossing the yard with the pail. Coldiron set the pail down, looked at Ballinger for what felt like a long time, and said only that some debts a man takes on without knowing the terms, and by the time he understands them, walking away costs more than paying them out. Then he picked the pail back up and went inside. Ballinger also testified, and the court reporter noted that he grew visibly unwilling to continue at this point, that in the last year he had seen cold iron, the trapper's hands had changed. Both palms and the pads of every finger were scarred in a pattern Ballinger could only compare to rope burn. Dozens of thin parallel lines that never fully healed, kept wrapped in rags even in warm weather, and never once explained, even when Ballinger asked him outright. Bollinger's wife Susan gave a shorter statement of her own, taken separately, in which she said only that in the last 2 winters she had refused to let her own children walk the trail past the cold iron place after midday, on no stronger evidence than a feeling she could not put into words for the court, and that cold iron himself, on the one occasion she met him on the road, had crossed to the far side without a greeting, as though the courtesy of speaking to a neighbor's wife had become, for him, more than he could spare. Deputy Purnell's report, filed with the Izard County Sheriff's Office on the 9th of March, 1874, is a document of careful, almost stubborn plainness, the kind a lawman writes when he has seen something his job gives him no vocabulary for, and has decided to record only what can be measured. He recorded the dimensions of the smokehouse floor. He recorded that the drying poles, tested by hand, showed wear consistent with many years of heavy weight hung and removed, though nothing hung from them now. He recorded that the swept condition of the floor stone suggested regular, deliberate cleaning rather than neglect. He recorded the tally book by weight and page count, and noted it had been examined by the county coroner, a physician named Ansel Dade, who rode up from Melbourne 4 days after the cabin was found, for evidence of any crime committable under Arkansas law. Dade's supplementary note, attached to Purnell's report, states that he found the cabin's food stores, tool inventory, and trap lines all in order, consistent with a man who intended to return, and that he could find no physical trace of cold iron himself anywhere on the property, not in the smokehouse pit beneath the floor stones, which Purnell had pried up on a hunch, and not along the creek for a distance of better than a mile in either direction. A coroner's inquest requires a body, or at minimum credible evidence that a body exists to be accounted for, and Dade's finding, entered into the record on the 14th of March, was that no inquest could properly be convened, since there was, in the strict language of Arkansas law at the time, no one confirmed dead. Amos Coldiron was therefore never declared deceased by any Izard County court. He was simply struck from the tax rolls in 1876, 2 years after he vanished, under the standard procedure for abandoned land, and the hollow reverted to the county before being sold at auction in 1881 to a timber concern that never once logged it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Cold Iron's Hollow was not the only one in the Ozark uplands where a solitary man's outbuilding turned up reinforced from the outside instead of the inside, and where a nightly feeding, once begun, was never willingly broken off. In Newton County, roughly 40 miles west, A hide trader named Otis Vance kept a root cellar behind his cabin on Clabber Creek from 1851 until his own disappearance in the winter of 1859. Vance's neighbors, in statements gathered by a Newton County deputy years after the fact, and preserved today in a private collection rather than any courthouse, described the same evening ritual down to its smallest particulars: a covered container carried out at dusk, a fixed span of minutes spent behind a locked door, and a refusal to explain that hardened over the years into a refusal to be asked at all. Vance's cellar door, like Coldiron's Smokehouse, carried a hasp added to the outside sometime after the structure was first built, in a placement the deputy's notes describe as identical down to the screw holes, though the two men, so far as anyone has determined, never met, and worked hollows separated by two mountain ridges and a full generation. The Newton County deputy who took those statements, a man remembered in the county's own centennial history only by his surname, Rasco, closed his informal file on the Vance case with a line his descendants still keep among family papers rather than any archive, that whatever a man in that country chose to feed in secret, it seemed to prefer the same kind of door wherever it was fed. The second comparison is later and better documented. In 1891, a widower and small hog farmer named Reuben Latch, working a bottom outside Yellville in Marion County, was found to have built a stone-lined pit beneath his corn crib, reachable through a trapdoor only he held a key to, and to have kept, by the account of the hired boy who finally worked up the nerve to speak of it, a nightly schedule that matched Coldiron's and Vance's almost to the minute. Latch was still alive when the county physician arrived, though badly reduced in weight, and gave a statement before he died 11 days later of a cause the physician recorded only as exhaustion of the constitution. In that statement, taken down in the physician's own hand and preserved because the physician happened to be a meticulous keeper of papers who later donated them to a regional historical society, Latch used a phrase that appears nowhere else in any Ozark County record before or since, one that Coldiron's tally book, when it was finally read in full, would echo almost word for word. He said the thing beneath the crib had been small enough to carry in a coat pocket the winter he found it, that he had fed it at first out of nothing but curiosity, and that by the time fear would have been the sensible response, feeding it was no longer a choice left to him at all. Latch's physician added one further note, unremarked upon in his own time but strange in retrospect. Within 2 years of taking that statement, he had left general practice entirely for a post at a state hospital 200 miles away, and his surviving correspondence never mentions Reuben Latch again. Coldiron's tally book, the one Purnell found wrapped in oilcloth on the swept stone floor, runs to 61 pages in a small, careful hand, and for the first 44 of those pages, it is exactly what a trapper's tally book ought to be: dates, pelt counts, weights, prices paid at Sylamore, the ordinary bookkeeping of a working trade. Beginning on the 45th page, dated the second week of December 1868, a second column of entries starts beneath the trapping records, written smaller, as though Coldiron did not want the two kinds of accounting mistaken for one another. This second column carries no explanatory heading anywhere in the book. It simply begins. Between the 45th page and the 61st, there are 11 distinct gaps in these entries, one for every winter, each running between 9 and 14 days, always falling in the deepest stretch of January or February. Purnell's report notes the gaps without offering any theory for them. The county physician's supplementary note is more direct. He observed that the paper at each gap shows no sign of tearing or removal, that the entries simply stop and resume in the same hand and the same ink, as though nothing had been written on those days at all, a fact he found, in his own words, harder to account for than if the pages had been cut out. There is a further irregularity neither man's report addresses, though a Little Rock archivist who examined the book in 1951, when it was donated by a Melbourne family who had held it for 3 generations, was the first to set it down in writing. That archivist's name does not appear on the finding aid he prepared. The historical society that received his notes has no further record of him after that single donation was catalogued, and a colleague's letter, filed alongside it, mentions only that he had requested a transfer out of manuscript work entirely, without specifying to what. The final page of the second column, dated the 11th of February 1874, 3 days before the last date Ballinger could confirm seeing chimney smoke from Coldiron's cabin, reads as follows, transcribed here exactly as it appears in the book, spelling and all. 11 winters this coming March since I first found it, under the flat rock by the spring, no bigger than a barn cat, and thought it some kind of orphaned thing a fox had left, and I own I fed it that first night out of nothing but pity, and did not think on it again, till it come back the second night bigger. I have fed it every night since without missing, but the 11 nights it took my meat clean away from me, and left me with nothing to give, and those are the nights wrote blank in this book, for I could not bring myself to set down what I did instead. It has took the length of my arm from wrist to elbow only for the meat it needed, and left me the rest, and I have learned to be grateful for that mercy, though I do not know why it is a mercy at all. Tonight I carried the pail, same as always, and set it down inside, same as always, and stood my 20 minutes, same as always, and it did not come to the door, and I have never once in 11 winters known it to miss a night before this one. I do not know if that means it has had its fill of me at last, or if it means it has grown tired of waiting to be fed and gone looking on its own account, and I find I cannot decide which of those two thoughts frightens me the more. So I am leaving this book on the floor, where whoever finds it will see it plain, and I am going out the west trap line tonight, instead of staying to learn the answer. For a man can only feed a debt so long before he understands that leaving is its own kind of payment, and I have decided, God forgive me, that I would rather pay it that way. The land where Coldiron's cabin stood is owned today by the timber concern's corporate successor and has never been logged, a fact the company's own foresters attribute to nothing more than an old survey error that left the parcel permanently excluded from harvest rotation. The smokehouse itself was pulled down and burned within the week on Purnell's order, the stone scattered rather than reused, which was not the ordinary practice for good building stone in that country, and was never explained in any surviving record. The tally book passed from the sheriff's office into the hands of a Melbourne family, the details of the transfer unrecorded, and stayed in private keeping until it was donated to a regional historical society in 1951, where it can still be examined by appointment. 44 pages of ordinary trapping accounts, and 17 that are not. Bear Creek still runs cold out of that hollow, spring-fed as it always was, past the bench of ground where a cabin once stood, and a smokehouse once had 2 doors instead of 1. If Amos Coldiron's own last entry is taken at its word, then whatever he fed for 11 winters was not waiting behind that locked hasp on the night Wat Purnell finally broke it open. It had already gone looking on its own. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.